Good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to the 2024 Solutions for Congested Corridors Program Workshop. If this is where you were hoping to be, then you're in the right place. If not, I'm so very sorry, but you'll just have to listen to me talk for a little while now. I'm going to give it another couple of minutes or so while folks are logging in, and we'll go ahead and get started after that. So for those of you who just joined us, good afternoon. Welcome to the 2024 Solutions for Congested Corridors Program Workshop. Again, there are still people logging in, so we're going to go ahead and get started at 1:05 p.m., give folks a little bit of time to get adjusted. So welcome, and hang in there until 1:05. Okay, it's 1:04, maybe going on 1:05, but I'll stick to my 1:05 promise. Okay, it's 1:05. Good afternoon, and welcome to the 2024 Solutions for Congested Corridors Program Workshop. You will hear us refer to the program interchangeably as program and SECP through the course of this workshop. As a reminder, anytime we state we or us, we are referring to Commission staff. I am Naveen Habib. I manage this program, and I am joined by Matthew Yozgad, Deputy Director of SB1 Programming, to cover today's workshop. We also have additional members of our team joining us today to help moderate this workshop. This includes Benjamin Williams. Say hello to Ben. In these workshops, we plan to review and amend program guidelines to prepare for the next program cycle, which is cycle 4. These guidelines govern how the program will be implemented, facilitated, and reported on, as well as how funds will be distributed to reimburse agencies for expenditures. All proposed changes to the guidelines will be shared and discussed during these workshops. And with that, let's move on to some housekeeping items. Ben, if you can advance to the next slide, please. The one after this one. Thank you. These workshops are intended to be an active discussion, not a lecture. This is exactly why participants are strongly encouraged to use the interactive features to share their thoughts at any time during the workshop. If you plan to make a comment or ask a question, please clearly state your name and your organization's name. You may raise your hand or add a comment at any point during our presentation, and we will ensure that all comments are addressed as received. If you have multiple questions, please share them one at a time so that we may address each question in its entirety. And finally, as a reminder, your workshop registration link and phone number are unique to you. Please do not share this information with other participants as it duplicates the same attendee and creates confusion for commission staff. Any questions here? Okay, moving on to the next slide. Thank you. Workshop agendas are posted up to 10 calendar days in advance of each workshop. Presentations and recordings are posted after each workshop on the Commission's workshops webpage and the program webpage. We will make recommendations based on the consensus reached throughout roughly 2 workshops. For timeliness, additional time on any topic may be limited to ensure all scheduled topics are covered during the allotted time for any given workshop. Any questions on this? Okay, next slide, please. These are the topics we plan to cover during today's workshop. And with that, we will go ahead and get started with a quick program refresher on the next slide, please. The Solutions for Congested Corridors program is a competitive program which was established in 2017's landmark legislation, Senate Bill 1. $250 million are appropriated annually from the state highway account to provide funding to regional transportation planning agencies, county transportation commissions, and Caltrans to reduce congestion throughout the state. Projects must be included in comprehensive multimodal corridor plans and regional transportation plans to be eligible to compete for funds. The Commission encourages nominating projects that align with the state's climate goals, manage congestion through innovative strategies, and include multimodal solutions and advanced transportation equity. Please note that the Solutions for Congested Corridors program only funds the construction phase of a capital project. Next slide, please. Since the first program cycle in 2018, the Commission has programmed 26 projects for over $2 billion in program funds, of which $1.3 billion have been allocated as of fiscal year 2022-2023. Now I'm going to recap some information that we've shared in previous workshops, just as a refresher, and I'll remind you of some of those recaps later in the workshop as well. So next slide, please. We established that this cycle 4, will be a 2-year program spanning fiscal years 2025-26 and 2026-27. In addition to clarifying edits which will reinforce program requirements, there has been a greater consideration on workforce development, and we continue to advance equity in these program guidelines to consider equity throughout the project development, nomination, and selection process. We also covered lessons learned from cycle 3, tips for developing consistent and clear narratives for cycle 4 applications, the timely use of funds policy, and other frequently asked questions. Next slide. And we also covered the proposed timelines for program cycle 4, which you can see here on the screen in front of you, as well as the 2024 comprehensive multimodal corridor plan guidelines. Please note that this timeline is tentative and may be subject to changes. If there are any changes, we will notify you as soon as possible through email and by posting on the Commission's website. If you are curious about which phase we are entering summer 2024, where we will present draft guidelines and then ultimately adopt those guidelines and initiate the call for projects. Next slide, please. All proposed changes I plan to share today stem from your feedback. In the last cycle, we had the privilege of engaging in discussions with several of you during workshops, office hours, and debrief sessions, where you shared your thoughts on how we can improve the next program cycle. Common among them were the suggestions to reduce redundancy in criteria response requirements. You thought the questions were too similar, which resulted in duplicative or run-on responses throughout the application. You requested we include examples of projects or strategies for reference. We have provided additional examples as well as clearer guidance to help here. You wanted us to streamline the nomination requirements in Appendix A, specifically the project application format, so that you could recognize your applications better without too much repetition or redundancies. You also sought greater clarity about how to engage communities effectively, where to start, and how to continue. So we collaborated with advocates to determine more specific and proven strategies for you to reference or apply in the project development process. And finally, you asked that we try to limit major overhauls or changes to the program guidelines to alternate cycles. This would allow agencies to adjust to the changes and help set a baseline to measure progress with new requirements. We have received useful feedback throughout this cycle's workshop development process and have proposed additional changes accordingly. I'm going to pause here for any questions or comments. And I think I see a comment on SOCA. Is it Soka? Yes, in the webinar chat. And by the way, I just shared 2 links in the webinar chat. The 2022 SECP guidelines, which were cycle 3 guidelines, so you can follow along for a frame of reference. And then the 2024 draft equity supplement, which was shared during the March 27th equity focused workshop that I hosted, well, back in March. So that's also there for reference. Changes to the equity supplement will be discussed later in the workshop today. And I'm going to talk about the key changes as opposed to the entire supplement. But if you do want to see the full draft of the equity supplement, you can see that posted online from that link to follow along. And the question that was asked in the chat was, what is the reason behind SECP funds being construction phase only? Well, Soka, great question, because the legislature said so. That's how it's written into statute. That's what our limitation is, and we're focused on construction phase only. Congested corridors, I believe at the time that Senate Bill 1 was being written, the major issue with congested corridors that were outlined in the legislation itself was that they didn't have enough funds to perform construction. That was the major gap. So they closed that gap by providing construction phase only funding. So hopefully that answers your question. If you have a follow-up, please let us know by raising your hand or typing in a question in the Q&A or the webinar chat. Appreciate it. I'm going to move on to the next slide. You're welcome, Soka. Table of contents. So there are no changes to the table of contents. These are just the updated table of contents for the 2024 program guidelines. I put this here to make things a little bit easier to follow. I have placed red boxes around the sections that have been updated. I may share some of these updates out of order, but it is done so to make things easier to follow for the sake of this presentation. I also did this so that when we do share the full text of the draft guidelines later on, you have a frame of reference and you can refer back to this presentation, which I typically treat like a take-home document for you. So you can reference back to it as you're going through the full text of the guidelines. So hopefully you find this helpful. On to the next slide. So these are updates to eligible projects section. They were suggested by a few of our stakeholders to include and expand consideration for micro and paratransit, as well as non-medical and non-emergency medical transit services. They're non-controversial. They're just further expanding the category to be more inclusive. So unless anybody has any questions or comments here, I will pause here for just a minute and then move along. Okay, seeing no questions, moving on to the next slide. In February, Associate Deputy Director Bridget Driller from the Commission's planning team discussed potential updates to the language addressing comprehensive multimodal corridor plans in program guidelines. I'm going to refer to comprehensive multimodal corridor plans as CMCPs for short because it's a very lengthy term and I don't want to keep tripping over it. So as a reminder, CMCPs submitted in cycle 4 must be prepared in accordance with the Commission's existing 2018 CMCP guidelines. Following cycle 3, applicants will still be required to submit a CMCP self-certification form, which is included in Appendix B, and I will show that a little bit later in my presentation here. But on this slide, you can see the proposed updates to Section 10 of the Solutions for Congested Corridors Program Guidelines that were presented during the February and March workshops. No additional changes have been made since. As you can see, these are minor edits meant to clarify intent based on feedback we received directly from you. On to the next slide, please. Thank you. So we further clarified and revised the CMCP self-certification form checklist, which is in Appendix B. This is the item that I mentioned that I might take out of order a little bit. The appendices are usually at the end of the guidelines, but because this is directly referenced with Section 10, I just wanted to show you so you wouldn't forget about these changes. Overall, this list has decreased to 15 items total. Again, these changes were presented during our previous workshops and no additional changes have been made since. This is exactly how we presented it, I believe, back in March. But I will pause here to see if there are any questions about CMCPs. There always are, but we covered them in a lot of detail the last 2 workshops. So I did see a question, and it is from Alex Padilla. When does the CMCP need to be adopted for cycle 4? By or before program adoption. So right now we're in the guidelines phase. We opened the call for projects in fall of 2024. And then we plan to adopt the cycle 4 projects by June 2025. So by or before June 2025. Good question. And I think there is also another question from Peter Schleisman. I hope I did not butcher your name. If a project scope has changed since it was originally identified by a CMCP, will it be illegible? And here come my favorite 2 words of all times. It depends. It depends on how, oh, excellent, excellent. Cool name, by the way. So it depends, because if the scope has changed like majorly, like there have been major substantive changes to your project scope, then yes, your CMCP and arguably even the regional transportation plan should make record of that change. But if it's a minor change, something you can explain in the project application, then I think it would be fine. I don't think you would need to update the entire CMCP and then the corresponding RTP with a very minor scope change. And again, minor and major scope changes are somewhat subjective. So if that is the case for your project, I strongly recommend you reach out to Caltrans and CTC staff as soon as possible so that we can either meet or chat over email to discuss your specific project concerns. That's a great question. Thank you, Peter. Okay, yeah, thanks. And if there are any follow-ups to these questions, please let me know. I know CMCPs. I did want to let you know that in the February and March workshops, we did cover CMCPs in greater detail, and those recordings are available online on the SCCP webpage and the CTC workshops web pages. And those presentations included frequently asked questions for which we provided responses. So again, these presentations are like takeaway documents for you, and they stay on our web pages. So please feel free to go back and look at those, and hopefully some of your questions are answered therein as well. Not to say that I won't re-answer them here, but happy to provide some documentation there. Catherine has a question. I'm going to unmute you. You should be able to unmute yourself and talk, Catherine.
Yeah, hi, Kathy Studwell, SFMTA, San Francisco. I have a question concerning item number 14. Explains how community reps and the general public were engaged throughout the development of the plan. Which plan is being referred to here?
You're talking about item 14, community representatives were engaged throughout the development. So that would be the comprehensive multimodal corridor plan, the CMCP itself.
Okay, and the same with 15?
Yes.
Okay. Thank you.
You're welcome. Any other questions from anyone else? Okay. Well, we're going to be here a little bit, so if you do think of any questions, let me know. Meanwhile, I'm going to go back to talking at you during this time, but I strongly encourage you to ask questions if you have them. Kathy, I see your hands raised again. Did you want to offer another question or ask another question? Oh, no, okay. But yes, I will reiterate, I hope you will participate by asking questions. So moving on to the next slide. Thank you, Ben. We have further clarified the environmental clearance requirements in the screening criteria, which you can see here. We have reiterated that projects must achieve environmental clearance by program adoption. If you know your project may not be able to achieve clearance in that time, you must provide a detailed explanation of how the project can achieve clearance within 6 months of program adoption and include an anticipated process timeline, excuse me. This information is clearly outlined in Appendix A, which I will also share, but later in my presentation. Let me know if there are any questions about this slide. I'm just going to pause here for a couple of seconds. Okay, seeing no questions, let's move on to the next slide, please. So in cycle 3, we expanded the congestion evaluation criteria to align with CAFTI strategy 1.1. The updates that you see proposed here further emphasize the two distinct sections under congestion evaluation by sectioning them out as extent of congestion and proposed solution. This update was actually based on a lot of evaluator and stakeholder feedback that requested to delineate the two items a bit, and was previously covered in our previous workshops. But again, there are no major changes noted here. We just sectioned it out, so it's a format change. Oh, and then we did receive some feedback on the item under proposed solution, the first bullet, which says, how will the proposed improvements relieve congestion? Relieve was changed to mitigate based on feedback we received during one of our previous workshops. I believe the February workshop. I'm going to pause here for a couple of seconds. Kathy, I see you have a question. I think you can unmute yourself.
Oh, great. Thank you.
Mhm.
Again, Kathy with San Francisco Municipal Transportation. In terms of the extent of congestion, explain how much worse the problem may become under the no build over 20 years. Since everybody's transportation demand model is probably out of date at this point because of COVID, and most agencies have not had the opportunity to fully update their models, I'm wondering just how you're expecting us to quantify this for the purpose of the application.
Well, I would say utilize what you have, whatever modeling you do have available to you now. I'm not sure how that varies for each agency and what everyone's limitations are. But I haven't really seen any issues with the modeling that's been provided in the last Solutions for Congested Corridor program cycle from cycle 3. This is also the first time I've personally heard about that issue coming up, so I'm not really sure what else to say. So I'll ask Matthew to maybe address this if he has any idea or any frame of reference for this particular question.
No, honestly, I would say we expect that applicants are able to present us with the most up-to-date information and outputs from their determined methodologies that they can. Obviously, if one agency is giving us something that's, very recent versus another agency that's giving us something that's, appears a bit outdated, we do try to consider the variance in currency of the outputs, but I'm not sure, Catherine or Kathy, if that's what you're referring to. So if we haven't
Yeah,
addressed your question, maybe you can clarify a bit.
yeah. So it's basically that because of COVID, all the assumptions that go into developing a model have changed. Mode split, demand, housing, construction, job growth, etc. And most agencies haven't had the opportunity to change all of the inputs that go into a model.
Sure. So, okay, I think I understand what you're saying. So, we don't expect any any one criteria should be one size fits all. We do expect that our applicants qualify the outputs or the performance that they're providing us. So for instance, if you're providing us with details that you don't feel accurately depict, like details based on a methodology that doesn't accurately depict the congestion or the extent of congestion on an identified corridor based on these external factors that you just determined, right? The pandemic has caused folks to, no longer travel this route in frequency, over a couple of years, but the travelers are returning to this corridor. We will be sensitive to a narrative or a qualitative explanation to kind of narrate what you're describing as external factors. We're not just going to base it on the science of the methodology nor do I think we can. But to answer it any better than that, I don't
Yeah.
know. Yeah, we can't, I don't think there's anything we can put out or any,
Right.
we're not going to ask folks to start prorating information using their own assumptions. I think, through the qualitative narrative that any applicant can provide, we will absolutely consider the factors. And just to further demonstrate, it's not, these are not being evaluated by a single individual. Naveen is a program manager. She has a finance and policy background. She's going to have transportation engineers and transportation planners helping her with these evaluations. So there will be several different facets from the transportation expertise realm evaluating these and coming together and determining a consensus on how that particular criteria should be rated.
All right, I'll lower my hand.
Great. So I'm going to pause again here to see if there are any additional questions on this slide. And if not, then I'll go ahead and move on. Okay, seeing no questions or hands raised, I'm going to move on to the next slide, please. So these are some cleanup edits to the economic development and job creation and retention additional evaluation criteria that is found in section 17.2.4 of the guidelines. The new addition here is a request for applicants to provide the number and types of jobs created by the project's delivery, which many applicants in this program already provide. And that new addition is the second to last bullet that you see on this slide. I'm going to pause here for a second to give you a chance to read. And if you have any questions, please raise your hand or comment. Sona, you should be able to unmute yourself.
Thank you, Sona Bapan, LA Metro. So during last workshop, I was trying to understand whether there will be any specific language on workforce development, since this year there is a heightened emphasis on this element. And I think Matthew noted that we can go and look at TCEP language on workforce development, since it's more prominent there in that TCEP guidelines. Is this still the case?
Well, no. So when Matthew mentioned that at the time, we hadn't drafted something up for SCCP, but we were going to use the TCEP language as a jumping off point to develop something that related to SCCP. So the language that you see here in that second to last bullet, and I can read it out loud just for a frame of reference in a minute. That language was derived from the TCEP language to embed into the SCCP guidelines. But again, I want to reiterate that some of this information is already provided by applicants in the SACP program. So it's kind of just reiterating the expectation of work that's already being done with a little bit more additional detail for those applicants who maybe aren't collecting or reporting this information already in their project application. So I'm going to go ahead and read the bullet just in case some folks can't read it or can't see it. Provide the number and types of jobs created by this project's delivery. Include any efforts to develop local jobs and workforce development opportunities consistent with federal and state laws. For more information about workforce development, visit the California Workforce Development Board's website. I hope that answers your question, Sona, but if you have a follow-up, please let me know.
Oh, no, thank you.
Yeah. Any other questions or comments on this one? Going once, going twice. On to the next slide, Ben. Okay, so these are clarifying edits that we developed in consultation with the California Air Resources Board, or CARB for short. Some of these potential strategies have been removed to make room for others, but that does not mean those strategies cannot still be utilized. Just in our discussions with the Air Resources Board, Air Resources Board staff, we agreed that the existing examples skewed heavily in one direction, and the intent was not to limit or preclude other viable strategies at the expense of focusing on one. And I also want to share my appreciation for the CARB staff for working to develop some of these clarifying language updates with us. Hopefully goes a little bit goes a long way to improving the intent of what we're trying to do with these criteria. Any questions or comments here? And while you're thinking about whether you would like to ask a question or make a comment, just want to say that most of the changes that I present here today, as a reminder from what I said earlier, are mostly non-substantive changes. They're just clarifying edits because we received that as a pretty major feedback at the end of last cycle to reduce redundancy and repetition. So that's why I keep saying it at every slide. Okay. Seeing no questions, let's move on to the next slide, please. So this is a clarifying update to project signage requirements found in Part 7, Section 28 of the SCCP guidelines. And the reason for some of the larger red text that you see here is that with the Rebuilding California Funds rebranding, Caltrans was kind enough to provide a dedicated page with clear details about construction signage requirements. And we have also specified here that the commission's logo should be included on that signage. We did not have that stipulation included in the guidelines before because we thought it was inferred, but now we are making it an explicit request. And you can request the commission's official logo from the clerk of the commission, and the email is going to be embedded into that particular section. Any questions here? Comments, concerns, musings? Okay. On to the next slide. So as you may already be aware, Senate Bill 1's passage authorized the California Workforce Development Board to develop the SB1 workforce guidelines that agencies may use to develop or participate in pre-apprenticeship training programs to address the long-term need for a skilled transportation-focused workforce. You are, of course, very welcome to use the board's guidelines, and if you are already engaged in this work, you may track and report this information as part of the reporting requirements outlined in Part 7, Section 25 of the SCCP program guidelines. I'm going to pause here and see if there are any questions about this item. Okay, moving on to the next slide, please. The guideline screening criteria, environmental clearance updates that I mentioned earlier. Wow, that was a mouthful. The specific requirements are clearly outlined here in Appendix A for your reference as you develop your application. So just for any folks who are newer to the process, the guidelines are the start where we lay out the expectations and intent of the program and the objectives along with the criteria. And we list what the anticipated information required would be and how and what you provide. Appendix A covers some of the more instructional elements of those requirements. If they are not as clearly stipulated in the guidelines, we provide it in your application development area. So that's what Appendix A is for. We provide basic things like where do you put your titles, how many pages on your fact sheets, that kind of stuff. So under Appendix A, there's a specific segment dedicated to screening criteria where we further expand on any details or information about how you can respond to that screening criteria requirement within the guidelines narrative. So here we've provided that you have to confirm that the project has achieved or will achieve environmental clearance at the time of program adoption, which is the change or update we made in cycle 3. But we further explained that if not, the project must achieve environmental clearance within 6 months of program adoption, which again is from cycle 3. And here's the new stipulation. in detail explain how this will be accomplished and include an anticipated process timeline to ensure the project will meet this deadline. So essentially, if you know that your project will not make environmental clearance by program adoption, you need to provide a response as to why that won't happen, and then include an anticipated timeline. So if you think you'll get it done within the 4 months after program adoption, lay that out for us, give us what you're expecting to happen or anticipating to happen during those 4 months, so that we can ensure that your project is continues to remain competitive. And the second update that you see here, which is the little gold sticker, is we have provided further clarification on the Regional Transportation Plan and Sustainable Community Strategies, or RTP and SCS for short. We're requesting direct links, page numbers, and project identification numbers to make it easier for us to find your project referenced in the plan. This was a feedback that was provided by our evaluators last cycle. It was hard for them to verify applications through the screening criteria, which is required. Your project has to be included in a regional transportation plan, and we had to literally scour through every plan to find some of these project numbers. A lot of you did provide those ID numbers, so thank you, but if you can please include the specific page ID number and provide a link to your plan, that would be most appreciated. The other thing that we've added is that we are requesting agencies provide a signed letter from their Metropolitan Planning Organization, or MPO for short, to confirm that the project scope, schedule, and cost are consistent with the MPO's Regional Transportation Plan and Sustainable Community Strategy. I'm going to pause here to see if there are any questions or comments on this slide. So there's a question from Edward Emery, again, cool name. Not sure if an MPO should state the schedule and cost for a project is consistent with the RTP, since schedules can be fluid, especially if an RTP amendment is pending. Edward, do you want to come off mute maybe to address your comment in a little bit more detail, if you don't mind? You can raise your hand and I can unmute you.
Sorry about that. My internet seems to be a little unstable. I'm just trying to get clarification because I know that schedules, I mean, we all know that schedules can be can change frequently, and RTPs can be amendments can be processed. So I just don't know if there's a more direction on that.
Okay. Matthew, did you want to
Yeah,
maybe
Naveen,
this one?
I can chime in. And Edward, I appreciate, and I read your comment. I appreciate what you're adding to the conversation. So you were not the first one who has mentioned that. We also got similar comments in our Trade Corridor Enhancement Program workshop on Wednesday. So the desire here is to demonstrate that there is no conflict between the project that is being submitted to us and the one that is listed in the approved RTP SCS. And the reason that we're getting specifics to the nature of project cost, scope, and schedule, even though we understand schedules can change, and once projects become funded, there's an added cost constraint element, and maybe the schedule becomes updated. We're really asking, by having a letter from the MPO submitted, we're primarily asking that the MPO is aware that this project is coming forward and that concurs that the project being submitted is the project identified in their RTP. And the reason that we're going so far as to address this is there have been a handful of projects in the past couple of cycles where it has been drawn into question whether or not the project that we're funding or potentially funding is actually the project identified in the RTP. And so we're adding a bit more upfront requirement here But I guess what I'll say is we hear you on the schedule piece, and we do understand that schedules are updated, so schedules can be fluid. I don't know how much how much how much we would require beyond an MPO asserting that yes, this project meets the intent of what's listed in the RTP based on cost, scope, and schedule. But just know I'm taking these concerns back to our executive team because this was a direct request from them to prevent us from finding ourselves in a scenario where we may end up funding something that is in conflict with the statute for this program, which does require projects funded in this program to be incorporated and listed in an adopted regional transportation plan with a sustainable community strategy. So we're really just trying to keep ourselves as well as the applicant and the project out of that conflict. All that to say, we hear you, but there was a good reason for us to get this specific. So I hope that makes sense, at least for now.
Yes, thank you.
Okay. Oh, sorry, Edward. I accidentally asked you to unmute. Please ignore that. Okay. I see another question from Kathy. I will ask you to unmute yourself.
Yeah, piggybacking on that last question, our regional transportation plan, not the RTIP, but the Plan Bay Area 2050, doesn't talk about the full scope schedule budget. It lists the project, and it might say this is short-term, mid-term, long-term, but there's nothing as specific as, the project's cost and things like that. The RTIP, on the other hand, is something that must be completed if you want federal funds, and that's where, after the award has been issued, you go in and you update your RTIP with scope, schedule, budget. So, from our MPO, I don't know if Kenny and Carl are on the call from MTC, but I don't think they get that detailed in our regional transportation plan.
So Carl is on, and Carl, do you want to unmute yourself? Because I saw your hand go up at the same time.
Yeah, thank you, Naveen. Sorry, Kathy, I don't have your cell phone number, so I can't text you quickly on the side. This isn't a concern for MTC, and I can talk to you offline, Kathleen, about how we would approach this.
Thank you.
Yeah. And thank you, Naveen and Matthew, for workshop already.
Yeah, no worries. Thank you so much, both of you. Any other questions or comments on this particular slide? I'm going to give it another second or two, and then we'll move on. Okay, let's move on to the next slide, please. Thank you, Ben. I shared the proposed updates on the previous slides to provide you all a glimpse into the types of changes you can expect to see in the full guidelines. I do think that as part of what we've done during this entire workshop development process, I did want to provide you some background information on where some of these proposed updates to Appendix A came from. So as some of you may be aware, Cycle 3 was my first full program cycle here at the Commission. And it was my first time reviewing a lot of program applications that were submitted by all of you. And I wanted to share some overall observations about those applications that I hope you'll find helpful in Cycle 4. I shared these previously in another workshop, but it seems important to share it again. We're trying to streamline our guidelines, which I've been showing you this entire afternoon so far based on feedback provided by you. And the goal ultimately is for these updates to result in better organized and easier to follow applications. To this end, we've we've recommended that you tell your project story as directly and succinctly as possible, and that your project narrative should be contained to the nomination itself and limit use of additional appendices or external web pages for reference purposes, as much as you need to and only where necessary, hopefully. Such as, for example, in response to the community engagement criterion, where you may want to share data or metrics about the types and frequencies of engagement or your engagement plans, etc. So structure the application to match the order of the guidelines as much as possible. If I heard that if it was useful, I could create and provide a sample template that would help you visualize how to better organize your applications. And I am still working on that, so I plan to present it today, but I have some items that I still need to run by my management team before I can share that template. But I'll talk about it a little bit more later in this presentation. Based on that, I've updated Appendix A. You see a lot of red text here. Please do not let that alarm you. And I'm going to explain it. So bear with me here. So again, under Appendix A is where we provide additional instruction to the applicant on how they can respond to a criterion or what information they like. Just try to further explain what we provided in the guidelines, more from an instructional perspective and less from a policy or intent perspective. So here you'll see the evaluation criteria. The first change is we've split congestion evaluation criteria into A and B, which is what I shared with you earlier. It's split into extent of congestion and proposed solution. So that's how you should provide that response in your application, separated out by that section. So section 1A, extent of congestion, to respond to that in a narrative format. Same thing for section 1, part B. And then additional evaluation criteria. Safety, accessibility, there's nothing additional to add in addition to what we've provided in the guidelines. They're fairly straightforward. Community engagement, I'll table for now because I plan to cover it in just a few minutes. Then economic development, job creation and retention, air quality, greenhouse gases, you'll see that they're all numerically numbered out so that when you are doing your project application, please number those sections accordingly. And again, I am working on a draft template that I plan to share, and I will post it online. I promise it is coming. So I appreciate your patience with me there. I will scroll down to item 7, that's on the right-hand side of the slide, which says matching funds, and 8, deliverability. I have requested that you provide a combined response for these criteria. Again, this is a draft proposition. If you all disagree with this, let me know. But from what I saw in the applications in cycle 3, we ask you for a response to matching funds and deliverability criteria. And then there's another section for funding and deliverability in our previous guidelines. And a lot of that information was fairly repetitive and redundant. In fact, in most applications, it was identical. It was just repeated the same way. And I think it reduced the amount of space that you had to maybe respond to other criteria in the application. So in all my wisdom, I thought I would save you some time and just ask you to provide matching funds and deliverability information about your project once. So that would be here. You would combine that and respond to it. All the bullets you see underneath, they are not new. I just moved them from the existing funding and deliverability section up to matching funds and deliverability, and tried to make it clearer and as succinct as possible so it's easy for you to understand and provide that information. I know that's a change, so I'm going to let you sit with it for maybe a minute or two on this slide before I propose to move on to the next slide. So I'm going to mute myself, take a minute, look at it, see if you like it or hate it. There are 42 of you on this call, and I'm pretty sure at least one of you will have opinions. So please let me know what you think. And any feedback I receive today will actually further inform the template that I'm developing. So I would appreciate any feedback. Like it, hate it, whatever. So now I see your hand raised.
So the match is still not required, right? Because I don't see that
Yes.
in the text.
So yes, matching funds. So this is a little bit confusing in SCCP. Great question, as always, Sona. So in SCCP, we do not require matching funds. However, matching funds is an evaluated criterion in the guidelines. So each evaluated criterion, of which we have like a total of like 12, I think at this point, if I total them all in a way. So all the evaluated criteria, that when you respond to them, we look at them individually and then we look at the whole application holistically. So if you're responding to matching funds independently, while matching funds are not required to compete for SCCP funds, it is an evaluated criterion, which means that if you provide some sort of match, even if it's like a 2% or a 5% or a 10% match, like whatever that match looks like, it makes you more competitive, your project more competitive in that particular criterion. So the more matching funds you have, or the better your deliverability will be, or the more cost effective your project is, or the more community engagement you did on each of those specific criterion, you will be able to perform better in that criterion if you are able to provide more information or more data, or you're in matching funds' case, the more matching funds you have, you'll be more competitive in that criterion. So hopefully that's helpful, Sona. Let me know if you have a follow-up.
I have a follow-up on two other items here. So seems like collaboration is something new that has been added. Is that correct,
No.
Naveen? No?
No.
Oh, okay.
None of the information here is new. It's just reorganized. And that's why it's in red ink, because it's
Okay.
reorganized. Before, the evaluation criteria just kind of had like a lump sum paragraph to talk about each of the different expectations and instructions under Appendix A. I chose to make it match what we have laid out in our guidelines, because I won't name which applications, but there were certain applicants that did this really well, and evaluators responded really positively to that organized structure where it was like a one-to-one. Like if they're talking about congestion evaluation criteria and extent of congestion, they parsed it out with Section 1, congestion evaluation criteria. They organized their application and made the readability of the application much easier. These are very lengthy documents. So I decided to take that feedback from the evaluators and some of the examples that they cited that they really liked, and incorporate that as part of the instructional component under evaluation criteria in Appendix A. So none of the criteria you see listed here are brand new. These are existing criteria. And collaboration has always been a part of that.
Oh, thank you, Naveen. My apologies.
Oh, no apologies needed, Sona. This is why we're here. This is the whole purpose of these workshops.
So I have one additional comment, and
Okay.
this project came to my attention very recently and wasn't part of my office hours discussion with you. So the environmental was completed in 2018, and it's going to be recertified soon. However, the data in the environmental document won't change, the content won't change. And as part of the environmental, the team has done community engagement. So I was wondering whether it's acceptable by the commission to show the engagement in the environmental document, or we need to do more to better do for this criteria in this section.
So let me clarify first. Are you talking about community engagement performed specifically for the environmental portion, or are you talking about the whole of the project?
The environmental portion of the project. I think that would be a correct assumption. I need to go back and clarify with the team.
So not knowing too many details about the project overall, when you're responding to the community engagement criterion, and I would argue for the same for all of the rest of the criteria as well, you should respond for your project as a whole and not just any particular phase of it. At least start off that way in the narrative so that you lay out what you've done for the whole project. And then if you have more recent engagement that you want to talk about for a specific phase, like, oh, we just completed this for environmental, and you want to provide any sort of data or engagement information, then you can dive into that more granular detail. But I do recommend providing the overall plan, like, oh, we developed X plan, and this is what we're planning to do, or this is what we've already done. This is what was most recently performed. And then this is what's coming up. So provide that frame of reference. I do hesitate to say, don't embed things. Do not do the, what are those called? The nesting dolls? Don't do that, where you put something inside another document, and then reference that document and tell us to go find it, because unless it's explicitly written into the narrative of your project application, evaluators will not go searching for it in the document, link to a document, link to a document. You can link to things and you can reference things and include them as additional appendices for reference, but in your immediate project narrative where you're responding to the criteria, I strongly recommend you put out whatever you want to reference directly into the narrative. And that way, if you do want to reference out, then you can say, see blah, blah, blah for additional details or data or metrics, but I would include the meat of the information in the narrative.
Thank you, Naveen. I'm sorry, I have follow-up questions. So you mentioned about this is what we are planning to do. So just in case we want to do additional community engagement following the application process or application submittal in November, December timeline, is there a timeline or deadline that we can do the additional engagement, maybe perhaps before the program adoption next year?
You can, and I'll dive into this during the equity supplement and community engagement update here in a little bit, but this is a really good question because this is part of your project story, right? So your project doesn't just suddenly magically wrap up and conclude the minute you hit submit on the application and send it over to us. It continues. You continue to do work on it and make progress on it while you're waiting to hear back from us. So I would strongly recommend you put that in your application and say, hey, we're at the time of project submission or like application submission, this is where we are with our community engagement plan. And these are the next like 3 milestones or 10 milestones that are coming up. And here is what we're planning to do for them, and provide any kind of quantitative or qualitative information related to that specific portion of what's coming up to give us a frame of reference. Like, yeah, we haven't done this yet, but we have this in the works. We have this planned. If you have dates and times for those, like they're already scheduled events, even better, put that in so that when evaluators are looking at your community engagement plan, don't short yourself by not giving us that bigger picture. Tell us, hey, we're doing the work, it's coming up, or we've done this, and here's what we can look forward to. So show it off, tell us about it. Even if you haven't done it yet, what's important is that you have something planned, you have something in the works. It may get amended, it may get changed or shifted, but you can always provide us additional information when a project is recommended. Like, so if we are proposing staff recommendations, if you have additional like updates or something, you can send that as supplementary information that we can include in the program adoption book item, for example. So those are all possibilities that we can explore, but we don't know what you don't tell us, is a short way of saying that.
Thank you, Naveen. And I promise my last question on this slide. So regarding links, you mentioned links, and this question is coming from my participation in LPP office hours. I think it was mentioned that for at least on the LPP side, they prefer to see the documents as appendices rather than links. And I was looking at our previous applications, at least on the SCCP part. For example, cost effectiveness was linked in the application. Do you have any certain preference for this cycle? Are you or the commission okay with the links, or do you want to see the actual documents attached to the application?
So I think LPP and SCCP, I would say most SB1 programs were pretty similar. We're trying to be as accessible as possible. The only reason I can see for, and Lashara is here in case she wants to speak up and comment, but I'm going to answer this and see if she has anything additional to add. But I think the reason why they've said no links maybe is because a lot of times those links are broken. And that shortchanges you, the applicant. It doesn't do anything to the evaluation team. We're just like, we can't open a link. we can't really contact you and tell you, hey, your link's broken, because we can't really do that. So it shortchanges you. So I noticed a lot of the applicants last cycle, they included items in appendices, but then they also provided us a link if we wanted to go find it later, or we lost the document or something happened. So it was a double duty because it's available online, but they downloaded the online document, added it as a PDF, and shared it as an attachment with us. So I recommend being safer than sorry. So if you want to add something as an appendix, that's probably preferable. Less things for us to click out to and go find. But I also want to be mindful that some documents are very, very huge and difficult to mail. And so in that case, include them in a link like a Dropbox or some sort of FTP site where it will stay there, and make sure it's not a broken link. Make sure it's accessible and that we can find it. That onus for that is on the applicant, not the reviewer. So that hopefully gives you some context for why LPP is cautioning against providing links.
Thank you so much.
Yeah. You're welcome. And good question, Sona, as always. I know it's a little bit unnerving to ask one or more questions, but please don't. Literally, that is why we're here. That is why I've spent many a sleepless night putting this presentation together just for you. So if there are any questions, let me know. And Sarkis, I believe Sarkis had a comment. SB CAG supports the change to combine matching funds and deliverability. Yes. I feel very supported. Thank you, SB CAG. Any other questions or comments? I believe maybe Sona just covered everyone's questions all at once, which is always appreciated. Thank you, Sona. Well, we can always come back to that. I want to be mindful of time. We're at 2 p.m. and we have just under an hour to go. And this next part takes a little bit of time. So I'm going to move on to the next slide in the interest of time. However, if you do have a question you think of later, please feel free to interject, raise your hand, comment, or provide any kind of response. Happy to address it. Thank you very much, Ben. Okay. If you've been to the TSEP and LPP workshops in the last 2 days, you have already heard all of this. But as I shared during the March 27th, all SB1 programs equity-focused workshop, Commission staff have developed the equity supplement in collaboration with our Equity Advisory Roundtable and stakeholders to further the implementation of the Commission's racial equity statement in the SB1 competitive programs. This supplement provided important information on indicators that could be used to identify disadvantaged or historically impacted and marginalized groups, equity benefits, community engagement strategies, and anti-displacement resources, which were all intended to guide applicants like you to provide more detailed information about the project's benefits and impacts to disadvantaged or historically impacted and marginalized communities. In addition, community engagement became an evaluated criterion to ensure that the project selection process resulted in projects that provide more equitable outcomes to disadvantaged communities. Members of the Interagency Equity Advisory Committee then evaluated applicant responses to the community engagement criterion, which contributed to the Commission's overall project evaluations and helped to determine which projects were awarded over $1.7 billion in SB1 program funds. As advancing equity in transportation is an evolving process, the Commission endeavors to ensure program policies progress by embedding equity considerations in the project development, nomination, and selection process. In Cycle 4, we have continued to engage and collaborate with the Interagency Equity Advisory Committee and our stakeholders to further update SB1 program guidelines and to ensure projects with more equitable outcomes are competitive for funding awards. Next slide, please. Here you can see the proposed updates to the equity supplement in the 2024 SB1 program guidelines. Please remember, these are draft edits and may be subject to changes, including what we hear from you all today. I will also remind everybody that this presentation and all corresponding materials will be posted online after this workshop. Most of the proposed changes, again, are minor edits meant to clarify intent based on feedback we received directly from you. And I want to kick things off by amending the supplement title and removing the word competitive. The equity supplement will now apply to all SB1 programs, including the Local Partnership Formulaic Program, or LPPF, as we like to call it. We initiated this effort by focusing on our competitive programs and plan to advance equity in our formulaic programs as well. Many of you have shared the work you are already doing, and this provides you an opportunity to formally highlight how you are incorporating equitable practices in your eligible formulaic program projects. I'm going to pause here for any questions and to catch my breath, because that was a lot of words. Seeing no questions or comments, we can move on to the next slide, please. Here you can see the proposed revisions to the supplement's introduction and intent. While the edits may seem plentiful, they are mostly cleanup edits to reduce redundancies. We have reiterated our intent to consider equitable practices through a project's life cycle, which includes the planning, development, and delivery processes. Accordingly, we propose utilizing structural and procedural equity strategies like the ones provided within the supplement. Structural strategies reform planning practices to create inclusive, affordable, and resource-efficient transportation infrastructure, whereas procedural strategies provide special benefits to disadvantaged groups to create fairness in process. We have also added additional groups to consider and engage as part of the disadvantaged or historically impacted and marginalized groups, such as displaced or unhoused persons and individuals living with disabilities. I'm going to pause here to see if there are any questions. Seeing none, let's move on to the next slide, please. This is a proposed new addition to Section A. As a reminder, Section A lists example indicators used to identify disadvantaged or historically impacted and marginalized groups. The California Department of Transportation, or Caltrans's, Transportation Equity Index, also known as EQI, was developed to identify transportation-based priority populations for applicable funding programs and support planning and project-level analysis and identify opportunities to advance equitable outcomes during project planning, development, and design. Next slide, please. This is another proposed new addition to Section A. The United States Department of Transportation's Equitable Transportation Community Explorer, or ETC, is an interactive web application which uses census tracts and data to explore the cumulative impacts of transportation underinvestment in the areas of transportation insecurity, environmental burden, social vulnerability, health vulnerability, and climate and disaster risk burden. These additional resources can be utilized independently or in combination with the other indicators provided in Section A. I'm going to pause here for questions, and I see Sona has a question.
So last time we talked, there was this concern that the EQI would not be finalized by the time of guidelines adoption. So has anything changed since last workshop, between last workshop and now?
I believe CalSTA actually responded to this during the last workshop. The EQI is finalized and the tool is posted online. I think it's still in its initial phases, so there are probably maybe troubleshooting issues or whatnot. I wouldn't know. It's the information is listed. If you go back one slide for me, Ben, please. So if you click on that link, all the information related to the EQI is provided there. It is live and it is ready to be used. But if you have any questions or any issues in utilizing the tool, please contact the personnel that are listed as a frame of reference on that webpage.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, you're welcome. Thanks, Ben. We can move on to slide 29. So there we go. Thank you. So this is a proposed new addition to Section B. As a reminder, Section B lists example equity benefits that may result from inclusion and engagement strategies, such as those provided in Section C of the Equity Supplement. In addition to clarifying edits, we have added new benefits based on project applications we received in Cycle 3 and feedback from you. I want to specifically highlight item 7 that you see at the way bottom of that slide just now. This was a critical benefit yielded in a few applications in the last cycle as a direct and indirect result of community engagement practices. Greater emphasis was placed on ensuring first and last mile connectivity with multimodal options at transportation hubs to accommodate all types of travelers in the project area. And that was really cool to see in the app. So we've added that in as a sample benefit. Moving on to the next slide, please. These are our proposed revisions and new additions to Section C, which provides example inclusion and engagement strategies. Again, the goal with these revisions is to further clarify intent, which is not to simply inform communities, it is to include and engage them through the life cycle of the project development process. Based on the feedback we received during the March 27th equity-focused workshop, we further specified the types of engagement strategies that may be utilized, such as direct or indirect engagement strategies. Direct strategies may include meeting with community leaders to develop relationships, whereas indirect strategies may include sending out polls to survey community needs. Combined, these strategies can result in mutually beneficial relationships and critical information for residents, community leaders, and applicant agencies alike. I think we can move on to the next slide. Thank you. We have further expanded the potential strategies and tactics applicants may utilize to develop or bolster their inclusion and engagement efforts. As we continue to learn, mindful and meaningful inclusion and engagement are critical to successfully advance equity in transportation planning, as well as project development and delivery to cultivate thriving, harmonious communities in our state. Before I move on to the next slide, I'm going to pause here and let you know that this concludes the equity supplement changes portion of this presentation. So if you have any questions about the equity supplement or any changes that I've suggested here or any comments, or if you just want to share a joke to break up the monotony of me talking, you are more than welcome to do that right now. Are you all just waiting for like the 3-day weekend to start? Is that what's happening right now? Well, it's fine. You've been a great audience for most of the workshop, so I'll let this slide. This is fine. All right, so I'm going to move on to the next slide, but if you do think of something to say, please let me know. And I'm happy to go back to any of the previous slides that I've shared so far. So these final 3 slides that I'm about to share include our proposed revisions and new additions to the community engagement criterion that are included in all SB1 program guidelines. So we're going like way back into additional evaluation criteria. If you're looking for a frame of reference in the SCCP guidelines specifically, this is part 4, section 17.2.3 in the SCCP guidelines. Again, the goal here was to align the information in the community engagement criterion with the proposed changes in the equity supplement. These edits are focused on reducing repetition and redundancy. A new addition here is to not only see whether community feedback was incorporated into the project, but to confirm whether the community was informed of how their feedback was incorporated. And I believe that's on the next slide, actually. Thank you, Ben. And that particular segment that I just mentioned, if you look at the second bullet, you will see where the red ink starts, how did the agency directly engage them? The question immediately after incorporates that feedback. It says, how was community feedback incorporated into the project, and were they, the community, informed to this effect? The whole idea behind this was to close the feedback loop here so that when community members are asked for their input or community leaders are asked to engage with a project, they're not just kind of left hanging in the air after you've gotten what you needed out of them. You go back and let them know, hey, this is what we heard, and this is what we've chosen to do. What do you think? And that feedback loop continues, hopefully. So it's not just a start and stop or a one and done situation. You're creating a nice little loop. You circle back every time. On to the next slide, please. The other new addition is the last paragraph that you will see on this slide. Based on feedback we received during the March 27th equity-focused workshop, we have clarified that pre-existing community engagement plans can be referenced to respond to this criterion. We understand not all agencies have the bandwidth to develop new community engagement plans, or perhaps may have developed one in the recent past. We have suggested limiting qualifying past plans to those that were developed no more than 5 years ago. While somewhat arbitrary, this preference is based on the period often utilized by transportation and strategic plans and assumes that community demographics will not change drastically in less than 5 years' time. I do want to hear about you from this proposed change. If 5 years is good, or if you would prefer less time or more time, if you can explain why, that would be helpful too. Based on the TCEP and LPP workshops, this language will be amended a little bit further to add more clarifying information about what we mean by pre-existing plans or tactics that you already have going. So I'm going to address one of the comments we received that which is the reason why I'm going to add some additional clarification language is there are projects out there, especially in SCCP and TCEP, that have been around for 10, maybe 20 years, and they've just been building and building during that time. So while they may have developed an engagement plan like 10 years ago, they may not have a lot to say or a lot of changes to that engagement plan. So they wanted to know if like anything that they've done in the recent past, like 3 years or 5 years ago, would qualify, and that in fact would also qualify. What we mean by pre-existing plans is if you've done any recent engagement work or recently developed a brand new plan within the last 5 years, both of those stipulations would qualify under this particular update. So hopefully that makes some sense. If not, we will share that clarifying language when we present the draft guidelines in June, so you'll see it there. But I'm going to pause here so you can really soak in this language and let me know if you love 5 years, hate 5 years, don't care about the 5 years stipulation. And if I don't hear from you, I'm just going to assume it means you really like it. I'm a very positive thinker. Thank you, Sarkis, SV CAG. We positively support 5 years. And Matthew Yazgot, SB1 leader, also really likes it. So I think we're set between Sarkis and Matthew. And yeah, like I said before, any questions are valid too. Like if you want to ask us why we're doing this or why we didn't do it before or anything like that, I'm also happy to respond to that. But in the interest of time, I am going to move on because I haven't seen any questions come up or any additional comments. So Ben, off we go to the next slide, please. Thank you very much. This is where I may disappoint you slightly, and I apologize. So I'm still working, like I said, on the draft sample application template. I have it ready. I had some questions and I didn't really get a chance to come around to them, and that's on me, guys. But I will share that with you. It will be posted online as a sample template after the workshop. I'm going to try to do it by next week at the latest. This optional resource may be utilized to streamline how project applications are organized. Again, I am not requiring you to follow my sample template. I'm just offering you a visual aid to see how you would want to do that. I do like your creativity and your content, so don't by any means let me limit you there. The sample template is based on the changes proposed in Appendix A, which I shared with you earlier. And again, these are all draft changes and may be subject to additional changes until the final guidelines are adopted in August. Any questions or comments here? Seeing none, I'm going to move on to the next slide, please. Thank you. This is fairly self-explanatory. If you've been with SCCP, you know what this is. If you haven't, then I can talk about it a little bit. In Appendix G of the SCCP guidelines, there is this really great form called the State Highway System Project Impact Assessment Form. This form is only required for projects with a scope of work within the state highway right of way for projects that are not nominated by Caltrans. And a new version of this form will be included in the final adopted program guidelines. We're actually in the midst of updating this with Caltrans right now, so stay tuned. It will come with its own updated instructional sheet, so it'll be pretty self-explanatory. And the form's been in the guidelines since like the guidelines were created back in 2017, 2018, the first cycle. So nothing really new there. Usually the changes are pretty minimal too. Any questions or comments here? Okay, next slide, please, Ben. Thank you. As I have mentioned before, repeatedly ad nauseum during every single workshop, email, conversation, and office hour, this process relies heavily on the discussions and feedback we engage in with you, our partners and stakeholders. Our discussions with you during Cycle 3 debrief sessions served as a launch pad to improving Cycle 4 guidelines. The changes I've presented today culminate the Cycle 4 public guidelines development process that we kicked off in December 2023. I feel like a new fresh graduate and like we should throw our hats up in the air because we made it. Because we have hosted 5 public workshops during this period, during which you have provided your feedback effectively and timely, and we so very much appreciate your participation. So thank you. Please do note that we cannot make any major substantive alterations to the guidelines after the public workshops process has concluded. Any final feedback must be submitted to program managers by Thursday, May 30th. That's coming up in less than a week, and this may be considered during executive review. Any questions or comments here? I made you guys a nice little superhero at the bottom to make the slide extra special. I wish we could like show like reactions on the webinars because I just feel like I'm here in the ether talking to myself sometimes. But okay, I digress. I'm going to move on to the next slide, please, Ben. Thank you very much. So office hour sessions have concluded. We hosted 25 sessions and discussed around 40 projects. Just remember, please, that participating in the office hour sessions does not guarantee that a proposed project will be recommended for funding. We appreciated everybody who made the time along with their teams to gather here and talk to us about their projects one-on-one. We hope we answered your questions, but in the event that you have additional questions, just because office hours are concluded does not mean that you cannot contact us by phone, by email, or Telegram, whatever is available to you. We are happy to respond to any questions, comments, or concerns that you may have. Moving on to the next slide, please. Thank you. So today we recapped previous workshops, addressed key proposed changes to various sections of the 2024 Solutions for Congested Corridors Program Guidelines, and we dove into some additional feedback and questions that we received from you today. So we plan to present draft program guidelines to the Commission at the upcoming June meeting in Monterey. Final program guidelines will be presented for adoption at the August Commission meeting in San Diego. And then guidelines adoption will officially initiate the call for projects. Project nominations will be due late November 2024, that's this fall, and a specific date will be included in the final adopted guidelines. I mean, I already have a date, but sometimes they shift and I don't want to confuse folks. So look out for that final adopted guidelines, a date will be listed. Any questions, comments, concerns over here? Oh, great. I see a question from Augustin Barajas. I apologize for not asking during the relevant section. No apologies needed. You can ask anytime. Is the requirement of consistency with the RTP SCS needed at the time an application is due, or can this be affirmed or committed at adoption? At adoption is fine. If you cannot commit to it while you submit your application, please note that in the narrative that you will be submitting that information by or before program adoption within your application narrative itself. You're very welcome.
Naveen, I'm just going to add one really small caveat. Let's
Sure.
say you tell us in your application that you are approaching concurrence with this rule, but you don't have it by the point that you submit an application. If your project is deemed competitive and we end up getting to the point where we will recommend it for approval, we will work with you at that point to determine that you will meet that milestone. If we find out at that time that you will not meet that milestone, we will remove your project from consideration and move down the list. So we won't just take that you're telling us in the application it'll be done. We will absolutely verify. But thank you for the question.
Thanks for clarifying, Matthew. I also want to highlight Braden Duran for asking the most important question of today's workshop. Did you work overnight on the superhero? Braden, I may or may not have. You will never know. I'm moving on to the next. Actually, you know what? Let's give it a second, just in case somebody else has something to say. I apologize. I don't want to just move on. We do have a little bit of time left if there are any questions. So I apologize if I butcher your name, Shauna Gauze. Circling back to Kathy's comment about the models being outdated, this seems like it could pose difficulties with the performance evaluations after the projects are completed. Shauna, do you want to come off mute to maybe talk about this a little bit more?
Unmute. Sorry, it took me a second to find the unmute button.
But
Thank
that's
you.
totally okay. And please do say your name for me because I'm really hoping I didn't butcher it too badly.
No, you did it exactly right. Shauna Gauze with the Sonoma County Transportation Authority. And I was sitting on this comment because I don't really want to try to reinvent the wheel at the 11th hour. But after Kathy's comment about the models that all of the project sponsors are using for traffic patterns and so forth being outdated, it seems like, you know, there are performance criteria and performance evaluations that have to be done when the project is completed. And if traffic patterns and so forth have changed post-COVID, then the evaluations that are being used based on models that are outdated are not going to support what we were looking for when we get to the end. Does that make sense?
It does make sense. And I think as I will say that as you're the expert in those, because you're the ones developing those or using those models, can I ask you a return question just so I can understand? What do you propose or envision as a possible solution here?
I was thinking just along the lines of, I don't know, a qualifier statement or something that in the guidelines that talks about the understanding of, you know, traffic patterns and models being updated, and while we transition that, because as Matthew mentioned, you're not going to base it entirely on the models. You're open to having a narrative that discusses what other conditions that are trying to be addressed and how that could be evaluated. I just think that it needs to be understood that basing evaluations on outdated models is going to end up with data that doesn't support the project at the end. So I don't know exactly how to fix it right now until we get updated models, which we are all in the process of doing, but we're just starting that process. So I don't know how we get there from here. I just feel like it might be worth a sentence or two. And this is just food for thought as you move forward with the guidelines. I'm not asking you to change anything at the 11th hour.
No, I agree, but Matthew, go ahead.
No, I was just going to say, Shauna, so I want to make sure I understand. So you're referring to, let's say all of our applicants produce metrics, they qualify the means that they're calculating those metrics, and then the successful projects may end up using alternate or updated models to demonstrate outcomes or outputs that they're that will ultimately be put to use or realized when the project is built. So you're referring to, if a project is successful, what ends up happening if when the reporting at post completion, if the models are different. Is that what you're asking?
Yes.
Okay,
or,
so
yeah, because we won't be using the same models, or we won't be
which is
using the same
so
data.
which is totally understandable. And so actually what you're referring to, or at least I think you're referring to, is actually some of our reporting requirements in the accountability guidelines. So the accountability and transparency guidelines that we have, which kind of governs baseline agreements and quarterly and semi-annual reporting requirements, as well as reporting out on project completion. Because in Naveen's guidelines for SCCP, we are only talking about performance as anticipated over, I believe, like a 20-year period. So from the built or from the no build compared to the build, from a baseline to the 20-year period. So we're not actually asking in the SECP guidelines for additional performance once the project is actually built. We're treating everything up front. I believe there's currently an immense amount of flexibility built into the accountability guidelines when a project is completed and we ask for reporting. I believe it's every 5 years after project completion is a look back on how is the project actually performing. If you know, I can send this to you. I'll send that link. Well, actually, maybe I'll just link it if I can before we get out of here. I'll refer to the accountability guidelines for the whole group, but you can look and review the section I'm talking about. And the way it's currently written, we are not holding agencies accountable to the same methods that they used to produce those forecasted numbers. We would hope that agencies can provide more factual numbers now that the project is actually open for service or open to the public. So I think, I guess all this to say, I think the flexibility you're looking for is already integrated, even if we are not explicitly saying you can use different models. I think it's that we're not, nowhere is it requiring that if you're successful and you look back, that you have to use that same old methodology. We would hope and anticipate that that you're using something new.
Okay, thank you. It was just a, you know, an idea I was sitting on, and I didn't want to let it go.
This is a really important topic, and thank you, Naveen, for indulging me in talking about it a little bit more, because we do want to make sure we're being you know, as clear as we can about what our expectations are, because we know you all as our stakeholders and potential recipients of funds you want to make sure you're not breaking any rules or doing anything incorrect. So I appreciate that.
Can I also, Matthew, while you're still here, ask a question in return? So based on what Shauna was saying, could they also add that one sentence narrative in their actual application about the demand model, just as a caveat, like this is an existing problem that's being mitigated, and that might be the reason between the differences, like at the start of the project versus the end of the project? Like she was asking if we could put it into the guidelines, but maybe they could stipulate it in their narrative.
Yeah, like it's almost like a preview to what we might expect should we fund the project, and then have a look back. Absolutely. You know, I think at that point, I don't know. Yeah, I actually, an auditor might go back and look at the application. You know, we would not prevent them from doing so. So certainly including that clause or that sentence in an application would not hurt, and could potentially benefit the variance and methodologies being used. So that's a good suggestion.
Yeah, and it came from Shauna, so I think it'd be a good idea. So if anybody wants to include that specific caveat in their narratives, please by all means do so. Any other questions or comments? You can ask Matthew his favorite movie. He'll share that too. He's here now. And he's taken his camera off as a result. He's run away. It's his favorite question. Always ask him when you see him. Okay, I see no questions right now. So just preemptively, I'm gonna shift into my next slide, because it's very important for you to be able to contact us. Our contact information is provided here, and it is also available on the Commission's website. I have also embedded links that redirect to the SB1 programs and Solutions for Congested Corridors program web pages for your convenience here. Feel free to contact us with any questions or comments, or just anything, anytime. We are happy to help as best as we can. I want to thank you all for joining us today. These workshops, again, are only as effective as the people who participate in them, and you are always exceptional. I am so glad you enjoy my weird humor and sometimes laugh with me silently, hopefully, in the comforts of your offices and cubicles around the state. I hope you enjoy a restful long weekend, and we hope to see you at the next commission meeting. Again, if you think of any questions after the conclusion of this workshop, please let me know, and have a great weekend. Sarkis, you're still here. Hello.
Hi, can you hear me?
I can hear you.
Since I think this is probably one of the final guidelines workshops, we just wanted to express our thanks to you, Lashara, Kayla, and Matthew, and the SB1 team for all the workshops and your transparency and accountability. And this is a really big lift with what you guys are doing, and you're we're excited for this cycle, but it's a reflection of all the good work that you guys have put into the all the process. So thank you.
No, thank you, Sarkis. We always appreciate hearing positive and constructive feedback from all of you. We wouldn't keep moving to where we're going without all of you and your participation, your expertise, your support, and your feedback. So thank you so very much for always being here with us, standing with us, and sharing with us. We really appreciate it. And I see people are starting to jump ship, and I don't blame them because it is Friday afternoon and I want to take a nap, and it's Memorial Day weekend. So have an excellent holiday weekend, everybody, and we'll see you at the next commission meeting. Thank you again.